The first time I realized my family was willing to erase me, it happened in a conference room with my last name printed on the glass door. I was standing in the lobby of Harrington and Cole Development on East Randolph Street in Chicago when my phone buzzed with a calendar alert I hadn't scheduled. Emergency board vote, 9 a.m. Mandatory attendance. The meeting had started 12 minutes earlier. I knew immediately it wasn't a mistake. Before I go any further, if stories about family drama, betrayal, and revenge resonate with you, stay with me. Like the video, leave a comment if this feels familiar, and subscribe. This story doesn't explode all at once. It tightens slowly, then it snaps. My name is Claire Harrington. I was 32 years old that morning. I was the director of operations at the same real estate development firm my grandfather had built from a single duplex on the South Side in 1978. I'd been promoted 18 months earlier after overseeing 3 commercial redevelopments that closed ahead of schedule and under budget. On paper, I was indispensable. In reality, I was still the extra chair pulled in when the room got crowded. My father, Richard Harrington, was the CEO. My older brother, Evan Harrington, was the golden child, vice president of acquisitions by title, heir apparent by assumption. My mother, Susan Harrington, didn't work at the company, but she didn't need to. She ran our family the way some people run a boardroom, quietly, decisively, without leaving fingerprints. The receptionist avoided my eyes when I asked where the board was meeting. She gestured toward the glass-walled conference room without speaking. Inside, I could see silhouettes already seated. My father at the head of the table, Evan to his right, our outside counsel, Mark Feldman, flipping through a leather folder, and one empty chair. Mine. When I opened the door, the conversation stopped. Not awkwardly, not guiltily, precisely. Richard looked up at his watch before he looked at me. "You're late," he said, his voice flat. "I wasn't notified," I replied, taking my seat. I didn't apologize. I'd learned years ago that apologies were treated like admissions. Mark Feldman cleared his throat. "If everyone's present, we can proceed." Evan leaned back in his chair, hands folded behind his head. He didn't look at me. He never did when something important was happening. That was always my first warning. The vote concerned a restructuring of voting shares tied to a new holding entity, Harrington Legacy Group, LLC. I listened as Mark outlined the language. Technical, clean, final. The kind of language designed to sound neutral while quietly changing everything. That was the moment something shifted. Because my name wasn't mentioned once. Not as a director, not as a voting member, not as an interested party. When Mark finished, I spoke. "Where does my equity sit in this structure?" The room went still again. This time, it felt different. Not controlled, measured. Susan, seated against the wall like a silent observer, finally met my eyes. "Claire," she said gently, the way people speak to children in hospitals, "this isn't about you." That sentence landed harder than anything else that morning. Richard didn't correct her. Evan smiled. The vote passed unanimously. 4 hands raised. Mine stayed on the table. Afterward, no one lingered. Chairs slid back, papers were gathered. Mark shook hands and left. Evan clapped my father on the shoulder and said something I couldn't hear. Susan picked up her purse. I remained seated. When Richard finally turned to me, his expression was already tired. "We'll talk later." "We are talking now," I said. He exhaled. "You're too emotional for this, Claire." That was when I understood. Not just what they'd done, but how long they'd been planning it. This wasn't a sudden decision. It was the end of a process I hadn't been allowed to see. As they filed out, I noticed something else. The framed mission statement on the wall had been replaced. New branding. New logo. No Harrington name. Just Legacy Group. Legacy, I thought. Just not mine. I didn't follow them. I stayed in that room until the cleaning staff came in and pretended not to notice me. On the walk back to my office, memories surfaced that I'd always explained away. The Thanksgiving dinner 2 years earlier, when Evan announced a promotion I'd already earned, and everyone toasted him anyway. The Christmas, my birthday gift was a planner with my name misspelled, while Evan received a watch engraved with Dad's initials. The time I closed the Jefferson Park deal, and Susan told me, "Don't get ahead of yourself." I had mistaken tolerance for inclusion, silence for acceptance. By noon, an email went out company-wide announcing the restructuring. Evan was listed as Managing Director of Harrington Legacy Group. My title was unchanged. My authority quietly diminished. At 1:15 p.m., my assistant, Nora Jenkins, knocked on my door. Her smile was strained. "They've reassigned 2 of your projects." "To who?" She hesitated. "Evan." I nodded. "Thank you." When she left, I closed the door and sat very still. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I did what I'd learned to do growing up in that family, I observed. At 3:40 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Dinner tonight. Your grandmother wants everyone together." That was the first time Eleanor Harrington's name had come up all day. My grandmother. The woman who still owned 41% of the company. The woman whose will no one ever discussed in front of me. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. They hadn't just moved without me. They'd decided I wouldn't fight back. That night, I drove north to Winnetka, to the house I'd grown up in. The same house where my bedroom had been converted into a gym after I moved out. Where my achievements were treated like hobbies. Where love had always come with conditions. At the dining table, Eleanor sat at the head, her hands folded over a linen napkin. Sharp eyes, still commanding at 84. Susan poured wine. Richard talked about market volatility. Evan talked about vision. No one mentioned the meeting. Halfway through dessert, Eleanor set down her fork and looked directly at me. "Claire," she said, "do you still have that old key to the Michigan Avenue storage unit?" "Yes," I said. "Good," she replied. "You may need it soon." Susan stiffened. Evan frowned. Richard looked confused. I didn't ask questions. I never did when Eleanor Harrington spoke like that. That night, as I lay awake in my childhood bed, staring at the ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars still faintly clung, I realized something with absolute clarity. They thought this was over. It wasn't. And the next move wouldn't be theirs. I did not sleep that night. Not because I was angry, not because I was afraid. It was something colder than that. My mind kept replaying my grandmother's voice, calm and deliberate, cutting through the noise of dinner like a blade. "You may need it soon." Eleanor Harrington had never wasted words. Growing up, she was the only person in my family who didn't soften her sentences to spare feelings. She believed clarity was a form of respect. If she said something once, she expected you to remember it forever. At 6 a.m., I left my parents' house without saying goodbye. Susan was still asleep. Richard's car was already gone. Evan's, too. The driveway looked the way it always did after I left. Empty, as if I had never been there at all. The storage unit was on Michigan Avenue, 3 floors underground, climate-controlled, secured by a biometric lock that had been installed after my grandfather died. I had visited it exactly twice in my life. Once when I was 17, and Eleanor decided I was old enough to understand how documents could shape a future. And once after college, when she asked me to inventory some old files no one else wanted to touch. When the elevator doors opened, the hallway smelled faintly of paper and metal. The unit number was etched into my memory. 3B17. The key still worked. Inside, everything was exactly where Eleanor had left it. Banker boxes stacked neatly. Leather-bound ledgers. Rolled blueprints tied with fading red ribbon. This wasn't junk. This was history. The real history of Harrington and Cole, before it had been polished into something presentable. I didn't open everything. I didn't need to. In the second box from the left, I found what I was looking for. A sealed envelope, my name typed cleanly on the front. Claire Elizabeth Harrington. Inside was a copy of my grandmother's most recent will. Not a draft. Not notes. Executed. Witnessed. Filed. My hands were steady as I read. I noticed that about myself, how calm I felt. As if some part of me had already known what was coming and had simply been waiting for proof. Eleanor Harrington had structured her estate with surgical precision. The family home. The vacation property in Lake Geneva. Personal assets divided evenly between Richard and Evan. But the company was different. Her voting shares, the controlling interest, were placed into a trust. the Harrington Continuity Trust, and I was the sole trustee. More than that, the document included a clause that made my breath slow. In the event of corporate restructuring, merger, or transfer of voting power enacted without unanimous board consent, including the Director of Operations, trustee authority becomes immediately active. Director of Operations. Me. The meeting yesterday hadn't just sidelined me. It had triggered something they didn't know existed. I closed the envelope and sat back on the concrete floor. This wasn't revenge. Yet. It wasn't even action. It was leverage. At 10 a.m., my phone rang. Susan. I let it go to voicemail. At 10:30, Evan texted, "Dad says you left early. Everything okay?" I didn't reply. By noon, Richard called. "Claire," he said when I answered, his tone already weary. "Your mother tells me you were distant last night." "I was observant," I said. Silence. "We didn't exclude you yesterday," he said carefully. "This was a strategic decision. You removed my authority without informing me," I replied. "That's not strategy. That's betrayal." He sighed. "You're overreacting." I smiled to myself. Overreacting had always meant you noticed something inconvenient. That afternoon, I met with an attorney I'd already vetted months earlier, long before the board meeting. Her name was Julia Moreno. Corporate governance, succession disputes, discretion guaranteed. She read the trust documents without interruption. When she finished, she looked up at me. "They have no idea," she said. "No," I agreed. "They don't. What do you want to do?" I considered the question. Not emotionally, logically. "I want to wait," I said. "And I want to watch." Waiting wasn't passive. It was preparation. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern sharpened. Meetings I used to lead were rescheduled without me. Evan began sending emails summarizing decisions I had once made. Susan started dropping by my office unannounced, smiling too brightly, asking questions that sounded like concern but felt like surveillance. "You seem distracted," she said one morning, leaning against my doorframe. "Are you sure this role still fulfills you?" "It does," I replied. "I'm just paying attention now." Her smile faltered for half a second. Then it returned, practiced. The real shift came at Sunday dinner. Eleanor Harrington sat quietly while Susan spoke about the future, about legacy, about unity. "We need to think about the next generation," Susan said, glancing at Evan. "Continuity mattered." Eleanor took a sip of water. "Continuity only matters when it's honest." Susan stiffened. "Of course." Evan laughed lightly. "Grandma, you worry too much." Eleanor turned her gaze to him. "You should worry more." That was the first crack. 2 days later, an internal memo circulated announcing a shareholder presentation scheduled for the end of the quarter. Evan would lead it. The board would vote on finalizing the legacy group structure. Julia called me within minutes. "If that vote happens," she said, "you'll need to decide who you are in this story." I knew what she meant. I could stay quiet, let them finish what they'd started, accept a diminished role and keep the peace. Or I could step forward, not loudly, not emotionally, but with documents and timing and law on my side. That night, I went back to the storage unit. There was one more box I hadn't opened. Inside were handwritten letters, correspondence between my grandfather, Thomas Harrington, and Eleanor during the early years of the company. Discussions about ownership, about succession, about trust. One sentence stood out, written in my grandfather's careful script. "If they ever forget who kept this company alive, remind them." I folded the letter and placed it back in the box. The vote was 3 weeks away. They still thought I didn't know. They still thought I wouldn't move. And that assumption was about to cost them everything they believed they controlled. The first thing I did was stop reacting. That sounds small, but in my family, it was a rebellion. I stopped answering emails within minutes. I stopped offering solutions before problems were fully explained. I stopped filling the silences Evan created in meetings with jokes and summaries meant to smooth things over. I watched what happened when I withdrew the labor that had always made things easier for everyone else. Things started to wobble. At the Monday executive meeting, Evan stumbled through a pipeline update he clearly hadn't prepared. He mixed up timelines, credited the wrong project manager, quoted a projected return that had been revised downward 2 weeks earlier. No one corrected him. Not because they didn't notice, but because they were watching to see if I would. I didn't. Richard cleared his throat. "Let's circle back," he said, the phrase he used when something had gone wrong, but he didn't want to name it. After the meeting, Nora Jenkins came into my office and shut the door behind her. She had worked for me for 4 years. She knew the rhythm of my days better than anyone. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. "Yes," I said. "Why?" She hesitated. "People are nervous. They're not sure who's making decisions anymore." I met her eyes. "Who do you think should be?" She didn't answer immediately. Then, "You," she said. "It's always been you." That was the first time anyone inside the company said it out loud. By midweek, Susan's concern escalated into control. She invited me to lunch at a bistro near the office, the kind with white tablecloths and a hostess who knew her name. Susan Harrington never raised her voice. She didn't have to. She preferred implication. "You seem distant," she said after ordering, repeating the same line from before. "Your father is worried." "He didn't call," I replied. She smiled. "He doesn't want to pressure you." I took a sip of water. "Then why are we here?" Susan's eyes sharpened. "Evan is under a lot of stress. This transition hasn't been easy." "You transitioned without me," I said. "Stress is expected." Her smile thinned. "You always take things so personally." There it was. The familiar dismissal, delivered gently enough to sound like advice. "What do you want from me?" I asked. She leaned forward. "Support, cooperation, discretion." Discretion. The word hung between us. "You're still part of this family," she continued. "But families require flexibility." "I've been flexible my entire life," I said. "What you're asking for now is silence." Susan didn't deny it. That afternoon, Julia Moreno called with an update. "The shareholder presentation has been moved up," she said, 10 days from now. "And Claire, there's something else." I listened as she explained. Quietly, carefully. Evan had begun informal conversations with minority shareholders about consolidating votes, promising future incentives, floating the idea of a buyout structure that would effectively neutralize dissent. "He's building momentum," Julia said. "He thinks the board is aligned." "He thinks wrong," I replied. "Are you ready to intervene?" "Not yet," I said. "I want him comfortable." Comfort breeds carelessness. I'd learned that watching my family for decades. That weekend, Eleanor Harrington asked me to visit her alone. Her apartment overlooked Lake Michigan, all glass and light and silence. She sat by the window with a blanket over her knees, thinner than she used to be, but no less sharp. "They're rushing," she said after I poured her tea. "Yes," I agreed. "Rushing means fear," she said. "Fear means they know something is wrong, but not what." She reached for my hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm. "I didn't protect you when you were younger," she said. "I thought surviving them would make you stronger." "It did," I said. "Just not the way you expected." She nodded. "Good." Before I left, she handed me a small envelope. Inside was a notarized letter addressed to Julia Moreno. "If they challenge you," Eleanor said, "this removes doubt." I didn't open it until I was back in my car. It was a declaration of intent. Clear, undeniable. Eleanor affirmed her trust, her expectations, and her disappointment in any attempt to sideline the trustee she had chosen. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. On Tuesday morning, Evan called me for the first time in months, without pretense. "Can we talk?" he asked. "We're talking now," I replied. There was a pause. "You've been distant." "Yes, that's not helpful." "Neither was excluding me," I said. He exhaled. "Look, Claire, this isn't personal." I almost laughed. Almost. "You're consolidating power," I said. "That's always personal." "You're reading too much into this," he snapped, the mask finally slipping. "You were never meant to run the company." There it was, the truth he'd never said out loud. "Neither were you," I replied. "You were meant to inherit it." Silence. "We'll see," he said finally, and hung up. That night, an email went out announcing the finalized agenda for the shareholder presentation. My name was listed under Operations Overview. 10 minutes. At the end. I forwarded it to Julia. "They're giving you a token slot," she said. "It's optics." "Good," I replied. "I prefer being underestimated." I spent the next week preparing quietly, reviewing documents, cross-checking timelines, gathering emails and memos that showed exactly who had done what and when. I didn't plan a speech. I planned A reckoning. The night before the presentation, Susan texted me, "Please don't embarrass your father tomorrow." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed back, "That depends on what he chooses to defend." The next morning, I walked into the conference hall early. The room was set. The screens were tested. The seats filled slowly with shareholders, advisors, and board members who believed they knew how this would end. Evan stood at the front, confident, rehearsed, smiling. When he saw me, his smile tightened. I took my seat in the front row, folder in hand. 10 minutes, I thought. That was all they thought I deserved. It would be enough, because what I was about to introduce couldn't be voted away. And once it was said out loud, there would be no putting it back. The presentation began exactly on time. That alone told me how confident Evan was. In our company, meetings rarely started on time, unless someone wanted control from the first minute. Evan stood at the podium in a tailored navy suit, the new logo projected behind him. Harrington Legacy Group. Clean lines, modern font, no past, no clutter. He opened with a story about vision, about continuity, about honoring our grandfather while modernizing what he had built. I watched the room instead of him. Shareholders nodded at the right moments. A few smiled. Mark Feldman sat in the second row, hands folded, face neutral. My father sat off to the side, posture rigid, jaw tight. Susan sat beside him, one hand resting lightly on his arm, as if anchoring him in place. Evan spoke for 30 minutes, confident, polished. He never once looked at me. When he finished, there was applause. Not thunderous, respectful, satisfied. "Before we move to the vote," Mark said, stepping forward, "we'll hear a brief operational overview from Claire Harrington, Director of Operations." Brief. The word landed like a dismissal. I stood and walked to the podium without rushing, without smiling. The screen behind me still displayed Evan's final slide. Projected growth curves. Optimistic. Clean. I didn't touch the clicker. "Good morning," I said. My voice carried easily. I'd spent years in rooms like this. "I'll be brief." A few people chuckled softly. "I want to start with a clarification," I continued. "There's been a lot of language today about continuity and legacy. Those words matter, especially in a family business." I paused, just long enough to feel the room lean in. "My role as Director of Operations isn't ceremonial," I said. "It's structural. The projects discussed today, the revenue streams cited, the timelines used to justify this restructuring, they come from systems I built and oversaw." I clicked the remote. The screen changed. A timeline appeared. Dates, project names, margins. My name appeared repeatedly, attached to approvals, sign-offs, crisis resolutions. I didn't look at Evan. "I'm not here to debate vision," I said. "I'm here to address governance." Mark shifted in his seat. "Last month," I continued, "the board initiated a restructuring that transferred voting power into a new entity without unanimous consent from voting members, as defined by our governing documents." A murmur rippled through the room. Susan's hand tightened on Richard's arm. I clicked again. The Harrington Continuity Trust appeared on the screen. "I'm the trustee of this trust," I said calmly. "Appointed by Eleanor Harrington." Every head turned toward my grandmother, who sat quietly in the back row, hands folded, expression unreadable. "The trust holds the controlling interest of this company," I continued. "And its activation clause was triggered 2 weeks ago." Evan finally turned toward me. "What is this?" he said, his voice sharp. "This," I replied, meeting his gaze for the first time, "is the part you weren't told about." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I stated facts. "The restructuring you're about to vote on cannot proceed without trustee approval," I said, "which you don't have." The room went silent. Mark stood. "Claire, with respect, this is highly irregular. So was excluding a voting authority from a board decision," I said. "Yet, here we are." Richard stood abruptly. "This isn't appropriate," he said. "We'll adjourn and discuss this privately." "No," Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet. It cut through the room more effectively than any microphone. "No more private discussions," she said. "That's how we got here." She stood slowly, supported by a cane, and walked toward the front. No one stopped her. No one could. "I built this trust because I saw what was happening," Eleanor said, her gaze sweeping the room. I saw my granddaughter doing the work while being treated like an accessory. I saw decisions being made based on entitlement instead of competence. Susan stood. "Mother, you're confused." Eleanor turned to her. "Sit down, Susan." Susan froze, then sat. "This vote is suspended," Eleanor said. "Effective immediately." Mark looked at his notes. "Mrs. Harrington, legally speaking." "Legally speaking," Eleanor interrupted. "You'll listen to my trustee." All eyes returned to me. I felt something then. Not adrenaline, not fear, authority. "The vote is postponed," I said, "pending a full review of governance actions taken over the past 6 months." Evan stepped forward. "You can't do this." "I already did," I replied. Richard looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. Not as his daughter, not as a problem to manage, as a threat. The meeting dissolved quickly after that. People stood in clusters, whispering. Phones came out. Mark pulled Julia aside. Evan paced near the stage, running his hands through his hair. Susan approached me, her face pale. "You've humiliated us," she said in a low voice. "No," I replied. "I told the truth in public. That's not humiliation. That's consequence." Richard didn't speak to me. He didn't need to. His silence had always said more than his words. As the room emptied, Julia came to stand beside me. "That was clean," she said. "Controlled." "It wasn't the end," I said. "No," she agreed. "It was the beginning." That evening, my phone rang nonstop. Board members, minority shareholders, advisors who hadn't known where to place their loyalties until now. I didn't answer most of them. I went home and sat on my couch in the quiet of my apartment, the city humming outside my windows. For the first time since the board meeting weeks earlier, I felt something settle into place. They could no longer pretend I didn't exist. They could no longer move without me. But I also knew something else. People like my family didn't forgive exposure. They retaliated. And the next move wouldn't be made in a conference room. It would be personal. The retaliation started quietly, not with confrontation, not with shouting or threats. My family had never believed in wasting energy on open conflict. They believed in pressure, in isolation, in letting other people do the dirty work. 3 days after the shareholder meeting, an anonymous complaint was filed with Human Resources. It alleged misconduct, abuse of authority, improper influence over subordinates, vague enough to sound credible, serious enough to require an investigation. I was notified by email at 7:18 a.m. Temporary administrative leave pending review. I read it once, then again. Then I forwarded it to Julia Moreno with a single line. As expected, by 9 a.m., my building access card no longer worked. Nora Jenkins met me in the lobby, eyes red, holding a box of my personal items. A framed photo of Lake Geneva, a coffee mug from a project launch in Milwaukee, a notebook I'd carried for years. "I'm so sorry," she said. "They told me not to contact you." "You didn't," I replied. "You handed me a box." Her lips pressed together. "They're saying you're unstable." There it was. That word had weight in my family. It was how inconvenient women were described when they refused to stay small. I drove home without turning on the radio. I needed the silence. By noon, Susan had called twice, Richard once. Evan hadn't called at all. Instead, he sent an email. "For everyone's sake, let's keep this professional. We can talk when emotions cool down." Professional. From the man who had tried to erase me. I didn't respond. Julia called an hour later. "This is coordinated," she said. "They're building a narrative." "I know," I said. "How much time do we have?" "They're moving fast." "But they made a mistake." "What mistake?" "They're attacking you personally, instead of addressing governance. That opens doors they can't close." That afternoon, I received a call from someone I hadn't heard from in years. My aunt, Margaret Lowell. She was my mother's younger sister, the one who lived in St. Louis, the one Susan rarely mentioned. "Claire," she said cautiously, "I hope this isn't a bad time." "It's honest," I replied, "which is better." She sighed. "Your mother called me. She's upset. About? She says you're trying to take over the company, that you've turned your grandmother against the family." I let the silence stretch. Margaret continued. "I didn't call to scold you. I called because I've seen this before." "With who?" I asked. "With me," she said quietly. That caught my attention. "When your grandfather was alive," Margaret said, I questioned one of Richard's decisions. Just once. I asked for documentation. Susan never forgave me. I remembered Margaret being slowly edged out of family gatherings. The excuses, scheduling conflicts, the way she'd faded. They told people I was unstable, Margaret said. Emotional. Difficult. Eventually, people stopped asking questions. I closed my eyes. They're doing the same thing to you, she said. But you're in a different position. Yes, I said. I am. That evening, Eleanor Harrington called me directly. I heard they locked you out, she said. Yes. Good, she replied. They're panicking. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't need to. Eleanor had always believed that survival was proof enough. They want to paint you as reckless, she continued. So you must be precise. I am, I said. I know, she replied. That's why I chose you. After we hung up, I sat at my dining table and opened my laptop. I began organizing files, emails where Evan overrode safety concerns, memos Susan had forwarded, instructing HR to reassign staff away from me months before the restructuring, financial projections that had been altered after I'd submitted accurate ones, patterns, not chaos, strategy. At 11:42 p.m., a message came through LinkedIn. It was from Thomas Reed, a senior project manager who had left the company the year before. I saw what they did to you, he wrote. I kept everything. I stared at the screen. Kept what? I typed. Before he left, Evan pressured him to approve a site acquisition with unresolved zoning issues. Thomas had refused. The project went forward anyway. 6 months later, the city issued a stop work order. The cost overruns had been buried. Thomas had emails, recorded meetings, documentation showing Evan's direct involvement. I forwarded everything to Julia. Her reply came 10 minutes later. This changes the game. The next morning, the family escalated again. Susan showed up at my apartment. She didn't knock. She rang the bell once, then twice, then began knocking sharply, the way she used to when I was a teenager and she knew I was hiding something. I opened the door. She stepped inside without asking, her eyes scanning the room as if she expected to find evidence of wrongdoing in my furniture. You've gone too far, she said. I'm on leave, I replied. This is literally as far as I can go, she scoffed. Don't be cute. She sat down, crossing her legs, reclaiming space like it belonged to her. You've embarrassed this family, she said. Your father's health is suffering. He hasn't called, I said. He's ashamed, she snapped. No, I corrected gently. He's exposed. Her eyes flashed. You think this ends well for you? I think it ends honestly, I said. She leaned forward. You don't have the support you think you do. People are already questioning your stability. I nodded. You've always preferred that angle. She froze. I know what you're doing, I continued. You're isolating me so you can discredit me without addressing the facts. Susan laughed, sharp and humorless. Facts don't matter when perception is set. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something settle. You taught me that, I said. She stood abruptly. This is your last chance to stop. I met her gaze. No, this is yours. She left without another word. That afternoon, Julia called with urgency in her voice. They're filing an emergency motion, she said. They're trying to suspend trustee authority based on your leave status. Can they? They can try. The hearing is in 48 hours. 48 hours. I walked to my window and looked out at the city. People moved below, unaware that a war was unfolding quietly above their heads. Julia, I said, schedule my deposition. There was a pause. You're sure? Yes, I said. If they want to question my stability, they can do it under oath. I hung up and felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not anger, anticipation. Because once I was on record, once the questions started, I wouldn't just be defending myself, I would be exposing them, and there would be no going back. The deposition was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9. I arrived early, not because I needed the time, but because I wanted to see who would show up before they realized I was already there. The law offices of Bennett, Cross & Adler occupied the 23rd floor of a steel and glass building downtown. Neutral space, controlled temperature, designed to make people feel smaller than the process they were stepping into. Julia Moreno met me in the lobby. She wore a gray suit, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back tight. She didn't ask how I was feeling. Remember, she said as we rode the elevator, answer only what's asked. Don't fill silence. Let them carry the weight of their own questions. I know, I said. I grew up doing that. The conference room was already set. A long table, 2 pitchers of water, a court reporter adjusting her machine. On the far side sat my father's attorney, Leonard Price, a man who had represented our family for decades. Next to him was Mark Feldman. Across from them, Susan Harrington sat stiff-backed, hands folded in her lap. Evan Harrington was not there. That, too, was deliberate. Leonard smiled when he saw me. It didn't reach his eyes. "Claire," he said warmly, "this doesn't have to be adversarial." "It already is," I replied, and took my seat. Once we were sworn in, the questions began slowly. Background, education, job history. I answered clearly, evenly, without embellishment. I watched Susan out of the corner of my eye. She nodded occasionally, as if approving of my tone, as if this were still something she could manage. Then Leonard shifted. "Miss Harrington," he said, "can you describe your emotional state over the past 6 months?" Julia's pen stilled. "My emotional state?" I repeated. "Yes," Leonard said. "Any stress, anxiety, feelings of instability?" I took a sip of water. "I've experienced professional stress consistent with my role. Nothing abnormal." Susan leaned forward slightly. Leonard continued. "Have you ever felt overwhelmed by responsibility?" "No," I said. "I felt underestimated." Susan inhaled sharply. "Can you explain the difference?" Leonard asked. "Yes," I replied. "One is internal. The other is imposed." The court reporter's fingers moved faster. Leonard pressed on. "There are concerns that your recent actions may have been impulsive." "Which actions?" I asked. "Publicly challenging the board. Suspending a vote. Those actions were based on written legal authority," I said. "Impulsivity implies lack of planning. I had documentation prepared weeks in advance." I slid a folder across the table. Mark Feldman stiffened. Leonard glanced at the folder, but didn't open it. "Ms. Harrington, are you aware that several employees have expressed discomfort working under your leadership?" "Yes," I said. "I'm also aware those statements were collected after my authority was removed and my access restricted." Susan spoke for the first time. "Claire, don't you think you're being defensive?" I turned to her. "I think I'm being precise." Julia placed a hand lightly on the table. "Let's stay with the questions." Leonard cleared his throat. "Have you ever been advised to seek counseling for emotional regulation?" "No." "Have you ever been diagnosed with anxiety or depression?" "No." Susan's jaw tightened. Leonard hesitated, then said, "Ms. Harrington, would you describe your relationship with your family as strained?" "Yes," I said. "And when did that begin?" I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't know, but because the truth required careful framing. "It began," I said finally, "when my value became conditional." Susan stood abruptly. "This is outrageous." "Sit down," Leonard said sharply, then turned back to me. "Conditional on what?" "Compliance," I replied. Silence. Gratitude without equity. The room was very quiet. Leonard glanced at his notes. "No further questions at this time." Susan stared at me as if she were seeing something unfamiliar and threatening. Not defiance, independence. Outside the building, the air felt different, lighter. Julia walked beside me in silence until we reached the curb. "They overplayed it," she said finally. "There's nothing there." "I know," I replied. "What happens next?" "They pivot," she said. "And Claire, they'll get uglier." They didn't wait long. That afternoon, an article appeared on a local business blog. Anonymous sources, internal conflict, questions about leadership stability at Harrington Legacy Group. My name was mentioned once. Evans was mentioned 6 times. The framing was careful, concerned, neutral on the surface. But the implication was clear. Trouble. By evening, my phone lit up with messages. Not from my parents, from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Former colleagues, distant relatives. A woman I barely remembered from a Christmas dinner in 2011. "Are you okay? What's really going on? Your mother says she's worried about you." I didn't answer. Instead, I drove back to the Michigan Avenue storage unit. This time, I brought Eleanor Harrington with me. She moved slowly, leaning on her cane, but her eyes were sharp as ever. We sat on folding chairs under fluorescent lights while I opened the last box I'd never been allowed to touch. Inside were documents I had never seen. Early shareholder agreements. Notes from meetings before I was born. A letter from Thomas Harrington, written the year Evan was born. It was addressed to Eleanor. If Richard ever forgets that this company survives on discipline, not entitlement, remind him who held it together when I couldn't. Eleanor closed her eyes. I should have done this sooner, she said. You're doing it now, I replied. She reached into her purse and handed me a sealed envelope. I had this prepared last year, she said. I was waiting. What is it? A directive, she said. In the event of attempted trustee removal, I didn't open it yet. 2 days later, the emergency motion was filed. They wanted a judge to suspend my authority based on alleged instability and internal risk. Julia read the filing and laughed once, sharply. They cited the article, she said, and Susan's affidavit. Of course they did, I replied. The hearing was set for Monday morning. Family versus family. On the record. That night, Susan called from a private number. I answered. End this, she said without preamble. Before it destroys what's left. What's left of what? I asked. Our family, she said. I considered that word. Family. The way it had been used to excuse control, silence, erasure. I'm not destroying anything, I said. I'm documenting it. You think a judge will choose you over us? She snapped. I think the truth doesn't need choosing, I replied. She hung up. On Sunday evening, I finally opened Eleanor's envelope. Inside was a signed instruction authorizing me to initiate a full forensic audit of Harrington Legacy Group, effective immediately, with independent oversight. I smiled for the first time in weeks, because the hearing on Monday wasn't about my stability. It was about to become about theirs. And once an audit begins, nothing stays hidden. The courthouse smelled like old paper and disinfectant. Cook County Circuit Court, room 2403. Family names had passed through these halls for generations, but never mine. Not like this. This time, I wasn't a spectator or a footnote. I was the reason everyone was there. Julia Moreno walked beside me, calm and unhurried. Across the hallway, Richard Harrington stood with Leonard Price. Susan sat rigidly on a wooden bench, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Evan was there, finally, leaning against the wall, scrolling through his phone, as if this were an inconvenience, not a reckoning. He looked up when he saw me. Our eyes met for a moment. His expression was unreadable, not angry, not afraid, certain. That certainty had always been his greatest weakness. Inside the courtroom, Judge Harold Whitman took the bench precisely at 9. Late 60s, gray hair. Known for patience until it ran out. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the docket. Harrington Legacy Group, he said. Motion to suspend trustee authority. Leonard rose smoothly. Your Honor, we're here because the company faces internal instability caused by the actions of the trustee, Claire Harrington. We believe immediate intervention is necessary to protect the business and its employees. Judge Whitman nodded once and turned to Julia. Ms. Moreno? Julia stood. Your Honor, this motion is not about protection. It's about retaliation. My client exercised legally granted authority. In response, the opposing party attempted to discredit her instead of addressing the governance violations at issue. The judge leaned back. I've reviewed the filings. I'd like to hear directly from the trustee. All eyes turned to me. I stood without adjusting my jacket, without theatrics. Your Honor, I did not seek this role. I was appointed to it. When actions were taken that violated the governing documents, I intervened, calmly, legally. Everything since then has been an effort to remove me without addressing the underlying conduct. Leonard interrupted. Ms. Harrington's behavior. Judge Whitman raised a hand. You'll have your turn, I continued. I'm asking this court for one thing. Time. Time to complete an independent forensic audit authorized by the trust. Susan gasped audibly. Evan looked up from his phone. Leonard's head snapped toward me. An audit would be disruptive, he said quickly. Costly. Julia stepped in. Transparency often is. The judge studied me. What do you expect to find? I didn't hesitate. The truth. The silence that followed felt heavy. Judge Whitman turned to Eleanor Harrington, seated quietly behind us. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, "is this audit your intent?" Eleanor stood, leaning lightly on her cane. "It is," she said, "and it's overdue." Susan shook her head. "Mother, please." Eleanor didn't look at her. "I've watched this family mistake control for care for too long." The judge nodded slowly. "Motion to suspend trustee authority is denied." Leonard opened his mouth. "However," Judge Whitman continued, "I am granting authorization for the audit. Independent firm, full access, no interference." The gavel came down. Just like that, the narrative shifted. Outside the courtroom, the atmosphere cracked. Susan approached me first, her face tight with something that looked like fear. "You've gone too far," she said under her breath. "No," I replied. "I've gone on record." Evan laughed, short and sharp. "You think an audit scares us?" "I think it scares you," I said. "Otherwise, you wouldn't be smiling." Richard said nothing. He looked smaller than I remembered. Older. As they walked away, Julia leaned toward me. "They're already calling people," she said, "trying to control the fallout." "Let them," I replied. The audit firm was called Kessler and Bloom. Expensive. Relentless. Known for not caring whose name was on the building. Within a week, they'd moved into a temporary office on the same floor as Harrington Legacy Group. Their presence changed the air. People whispered. Doors closed faster. Emails got shorter. Nora Jenkins called me that night. "They're nervous," she said. "Evan's been asking who's been interviewed." "Have you been?" I asked. "Yes," she said. I told them the truth. "That's enough," I replied. 2 weeks in, the first irregularities surfaced. Minor at first. Expense accounts. Consulting fees paid to shell entities. Projects approved without proper review. Then came the zoning issue Thomas Reed had flagged. Then another. And another. Julia called me late one evening. "They've found something significant," she said. "Off-the-books payments tied to 2 acquisitions." "Evan?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "But not just him." That was the moment I realized this wasn't about one person. It was about a system. The family gathered for an emergency meeting at Eleanor's apartment. No lawyers, no assistants, just us. Susan paced. Richard sat heavily in a chair. Evan leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "This is out of control," Susan said. "We need to shut this down." "You can't," Eleanor replied calmly. "You tried." Evan finally spoke. "You wanted power, Claire. Congratulations. Look what it's costing." I met his gaze. "It's costing the truth time." Richard rubbed his face. "If this goes public." "It will," I said. Susan turned on me. "You're destroying your own family." I shook my head. "I'm exposing it." The audit report was scheduled for preliminary release in 10 days. 10 days until everything changed. That night, as I lay awake, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You should stop. Some things aren't meant to be uncovered." I stared at the screen, then deleted the message, because whoever sent it had finally understood. I wasn't backing down, and they were running out of places to hide. The first resignation came 3 days later. Not Evans, not Richards. It was the chief financial officer, Daniel Mercer, a man who had been with the company for 11 years and had never once missed a quarterly call. His email was brief, polite, and carefully worded. Personal reasons. Immediate effect. No farewell tour. No handshakes. Just absence. Kessler and Bloom requested his files within an hour. By the end of the week, 2 more departures followed. A senior compliance manager, a procurement director. People who had never been part of the family, but had learned how to survive around it. I watched it all from a distance. Still officially on administrative leave. Still painted as a risk. And yet somehow, everything was now moving through me. Julia called daily, sometimes twice. "They're hemorrhaging," she said one evening. "And Claire, they're starting to turn on each other." That didn't surprise me. Toxic systems always collapse inward before they collapse publicly. Susan's strategy shifted first. She stopped attacking me directly and started rewriting history. A long email went out to extended family, copied selectively. I didn't receive it, but Margaret Lowell forwarded it to me within minutes. Susan framed the situation as a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, a generational conflict exacerbated by stress and grief. Claire has always been sensitive, she wrote. We tried to protect her. Protect me. From what? Accountability? Margaret added a short note when she forwarded it. She's doing what she did to me, polishing the lie until it looks like concern. I replied with one sentence. I know. The next move came from Evan. He called me at midnight. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. Claire, he said, his voice low. We need to talk. We've talked, I replied. This is different, he said. This is about damage control. I waited. They're digging too deep, he continued. Things are going to come out that don't need to. That's not how audits work, I said. They come out because they exist. He exhaled sharply. You don't understand what you're doing. I understand exactly what I'm doing, I replied. I'm letting professionals do their jobs. You're letting them destroy everything, he snapped. No, I said calmly. You did that. I just stopped covering for it. Silence. Then, softer. What do you want? That question was the most revealing thing he'd said in his life. I want the truth documented, I said. And I want control removed from people who abuse it. That includes me, he said. Yes, I replied. He laughed quietly. You always were like this. Righteous. No, I said. I was observant. He hung up. 2 days later, Kessler and Bloom issued their preliminary findings. Not public. Not yet. But the board received a summary. Improper approvals. Failure to disclose conflicts of interest. Patterned manipulation of financial forecasts to justify acquisitions that benefited private entities tied to executive leadership. Executive leadership, plural. Julia came to my apartment that night with the document printed and bound. She didn't speak while I read. When I finished, I looked up. My father signed off on some of these. Yes, she said. And my mother? Julia hesitated. Not directly, but there are emails, instructions, influence, control without fingerprints. I sat back and felt something I hadn't expected. Grief, not for the company, not for the reputation, for the final confirmation that the people who raised me had known exactly what they were doing. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Friday. This time, I was formally invited. When I walked into the room, conversation stopped again. But the silence felt different now, less controlled, edgier. Evan wasn't at the head of the table. Richard was. He looked tired, older than his years. Susan sat beside him, spine straight, chin lifted. Mark Feldman was there. So was a representative from Kessler and Bloom. And Eleanor Harrington, seated calmly, as if this were exactly where she'd expected to end up. Richard cleared his throat. We've received the preliminary audit report. No one spoke. This is serious, he continued. And it's damaging. Yes, Eleanor said. That's what happens when damage is hidden too long. Susan turned to her. You wanted this. No, Eleanor replied. I wanted honesty. Evan arrived late. He didn't apologize. He sat down and looked directly at me. So, he said. What now? I stood. I've reviewed the report, I said. Based on these findings, I'm invoking trustee authority to restructure executive leadership. Susan's face drained of color. Richard stood abruptly. You can't remove me. I can, I said. And I am. The room erupted, Susan shouted. Evan cursed. Mark tried to speak over everyone at once. Eleanor raised her cane and struck it once against the floor. Silence. This ends now, she said. Not with forgiveness. With accountability, I continued. Effective immediately, Richard Harrington is suspended pending further investigation. Evan Harrington is removed from all executive roles. Evan laughed, sharp and disbelieving. You think this sticks? I know it does, I replied. Susan stood. You're doing this to punish us. I met her eyes. I'm doing this to stop you. The vote that followed was swift. Not unanimous, but decisive. Power shifted. Afterward, as people filed out, Richard lingered. Was it worth it? He asked, quietly. I considered him. The man who had taught me how to read contracts, how to negotiate, how to endure. Yes, I said, because I can live with the truth. That night, the first leak hit the press. Anonymously, of course, but accurate. By morning, Harrington Legacy Group was trending in business circles for all the wrong reasons. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't reacting. I was ready. Because the final phase wasn't about the company. It was about inheritance. The will arrived in my inbox at 6:12 a.m. Not a copy, not a rumor. A formal notice from Eleanor Harrington's estate attorney, Samuel Brooks, requesting my presence that afternoon. Private review, immediate relevance. I read the email twice before the meaning settled. This was no longer just about control of a company. It was about inheritance. By 8 o'clock, the news cycle had caught up. Headlines avoided names but not implications. Family business, internal audit, leadership shakeup, trust disputes. Words like betrayal and governance failure floated through articles written by people who didn't know us, and yet somehow described us perfectly. Susan left me 3 voicemails before noon. The first was anger. The second was grief. The third was strategy. "Claire," she said in the last one, voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "Whatever happens next, remember that families survive by compromise." I deleted all 3 without responding. At 1 p.m., I met Julia Moreno outside Samuel Brooks's office. She studied my face carefully. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. "I've been ready my entire life," I replied. Samuel Brooks was an older man, with kind eyes and a voice that never rushed. He ushered us into a small conference room, closed the door, and placed a leather folder on the table. "This is not a reading," he said. "It's a clarification." He opened the folder and slid a document toward me. "Eleanor Harrington's last will and testament." I didn't touch it yet. Samuel continued. "Your grandmother amended her will 18 months ago. Quietly. Legally. With full capacity." Julia glanced at me. I nodded. "The primary residence, liquid assets, and personal property are divided among her heirs," Samuel said. "However, the controlling interest in Harrington Legacy Group is addressed separately." He paused. "It is to be transferred in full to the Harrington Continuity Trust," he said. "With you, Claire Harrington, retaining sole trustee authority." I exhaled slowly. Susan had always assumed inheritance meant entitlement. Eleanor had seen inheritance as responsibility. "There's more," Samuel said. He slid a second document across the table. A letter. Handwritten. "Claire, if you are reading this, then the silence has finally broken. I know what they will say about you. I've heard it said about others before. That you are difficult. That you are emotional. That you are disruptive. What they mean is that you do not submit. This family mistakes obedience for loyalty and control for love. I did not stop it when I should have. That is my failure. This trust is not a reward. It is a safeguard. Use it carefully. Use it cleanly. And when the noise becomes unbearable, remember this. You were never wrong to want a seat at the table. You were wrong only to think they would give it to you. E.H. I folded the letter and placed it back in the folder. Julia was watching me closely. "How do you feel?" "Clear," I said. "The fallout began before I even left the building," Evan called. I didn't answer. Richard texted. "Just one line. You've taken everything." I typed back. Number 1. I stopped pretending it was yours. By evening, Susan's strategy collapsed completely. She contacted Samuel Brooks directly, demanding an emergency injunction. She accused Eleanor of manipulation, claimed undue influence, suggested cognitive decline. Samuel forwarded everything to Julia. "She's challenging capacity," Julia said. "It won't hold. The documentation is airtight." "That won't stop her from trying," I replied. It didn't. 2 days later, a petition was filed contesting the will. Family versus family. Again. But this time, the narrative was different. Susan wasn't protecting a legacy. She was attacking one. The hearing was scheduled quickly. Probate court. Judge Marlene Whitaker, known for patience and precision. Susan arrived with a new attorney. Younger, aggressive. She wore grief like armor. "My client believes her mother was manipulated," the attorney said. "Isolated. Influenced by a granddaughter with ulterior motives." Judge Whitaker turned to me. "Miss Harrington, did you influence your grandmother's decisions?" "No," I said. "I respected them." Susan shook her head. "You turned her against us." Eleanor, seated behind me, leaned forward. "I turned myself," she said, "long before Claire ever did." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Harrington, Are you of sound mind? Yes, Eleanor said. And I have been for 84 years. Susan's attorney tried a different angle. Why exclude your son and grandson from control? I didn't, Eleanor replied. I excluded their behavior. The courtroom went still. After a brief recess, Judge Whitaker returned. The will stands, she said. The challenge is denied. Susan sat down heavily. Evan stormed out. Richard didn't look at anyone. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Questions flew. Microphones appeared. I said nothing. That night, alone in my apartment, I felt the weight of it all settle. Not triumph, not victory, finality. I thought about Christmas dinners, where my voice had been ignored, birthdays forgotten, decisions made without me and justified afterward. I thought about how quietly power had shifted, not with shouting, not with revenge, with documentation, with patience, with boundaries. My phone buzzed. A message from Margaret. Proud of you. You broke the pattern. I stared out at the city lights and let myself feel it. Not joy. Relief. Because inheritance was never about money or buildings or control. It was about ending something that should have ended generations ago. And I was almost done. One chapter remained. The silence afterward was louder than any argument we'd ever had. No calls, no texts, no carefully worded emails pretending concern. For the first time since the will was upheld, my parents and my brother disappeared completely. Not even anger reached me, just absence. That, I learned, was their final tactic. If they could not control the story, they would erase themselves from it and hope the vacuum would pull me back in. Guilt had always been their most reliable lever. It didn't work anymore. 2 weeks after the probate hearing, the final audit report was released to the board. Not leaked, not softened, delivered. I sat at the head of the table this time. Not ceremonially, functionally. The Harrington Continuity Trust authorized it. The bylaws supported it. The room accepted it. Kessler and Bloom didn't editorialize. They never did. They presented facts. Unauthorized transactions totaling just over $4.3 million. Shell entities linked to Evan Harrington through intermediaries. Suppressed risk assessments signed off by Richard Harrington. HR interventions coordinated through Susan Harrington to isolate dissenting employees under the guise of cultural alignment. Cultural alignment. I watched the faces around the table as the findings were read. Some were shocked. Some looked relieved. A few looked ashamed. When the presentation ended, no one spoke. Finally, one of the independent board members, Helen Park, broke the silence. What happens now? I folded my hands on the table. Now we correct course. There was no drama in my voice. No vindication, just process. Richard Harrington's suspension became permanent. His severance was reduced under the morality clause he himself had approved years earlier. Evan Harrington's removal triggered a clawback provision tied to misconduct. The company's insurers were notified. Regulators were informed. Restitution discussions began. Susan Harrington was not an employee, not an executive, not a shareholder, but her influence evaporated overnight. No more access, no more informal authority, no more whispered instructions carried out in her name. She called me the day after the board vote. Her voice sounded smaller. Tired. You didn't have to take everything, she said. I closed my eyes. I didn't take anything. I returned it to where it belonged. You could have protected us, she said, privately. I protected the company, I replied. You were never the same thing. She was quiet for a long moment. I don't recognize you. I considered that. You never tried to. She hung up. That evening, I went back to the Michigan Avenue storage unit one last time. I didn't need anything from it anymore. The documents had done their work. The past no longer needed to be preserved as evidence. I took one thing with me. The framed photo of my grandfather standing in front of the first building he'd ever purchased. No ceremony, no entourage, just him, hands in his pockets, looking uncertain and determined at the same time. I hung it in my office the next morning. 3 months later, Harrington Legacy Group released a public statement. New leadership, new compliance framework, independent oversight, acknowledgement of failures without defensiveness or excuses. The market responded cautiously, then positively. Stability, it turned out, was attractive. I was officially reinstated, though the title changed. Interim CEO, pending permanent appointment. I didn't rush to make it permanent. Power earned too quickly can be handled carelessly. One afternoon, as I was reviewing revised governance policies, Nora Jenkins knocked on my door. She looked different, lighter. "They've been asking if you'll speak at the company town hall," she said. "About what?" I asked. "About the changes. About accountability." I nodded slowly. "Schedule it." The town hall was held in the same conference space where Evan had once stood so confidently. The logo behind me was unchanged. The company still carried the Harrington name, but the atmosphere was different. "I won't tell you this is a new beginning," I said to the room, "because that would imply the past didn't matter. It did, and it does." I paused. "What matters now is that we don't confuse silence with harmony, or loyalty with compliance, or family with immunity." No one clapped. They didn't need to. Afterward, Helen Park approached me. "You know they'll never forgive you." "I know," I said. "Does that bother you?" I thought about Susan's voice on the phone, Richard's silence, Evan's certainty finally cracking. "No," I replied. Forgiveness was never the goal. That night, I sat alone on my balcony, the city spread out below me. For the first time since this all began, I allowed myself to feel the exhaustion. Not collapse, completion. My phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor Harrington. "I'm proud of you. Not for what you took, for what you stopped." I typed back. "I learned it from you." The truth was, I hadn't won anything. I had closed a door. And in doing so, I'd created a boundary so clear it no longer needed defending. 2 chapters remained. One to deal with the past, one to step fully into what came next. And I intended to finish both on my own terms. Thanksgiving arrived quietly. No invitations. No group emails coordinating arrival times or arguing over side dishes. No passive-aggressive reminders about gratitude. For the first time in my life, the holiday passed without my family attempting to choreograph my presence. I noticed the absence the way you notice a missing tooth with your tongue. Not painful anymore, just strange. I spent Thanksgiving morning walking along the lake, the air sharp and clean. Chicago had that brittle blue sky that only appears when winter is close, but not yet cruel. I passed families unloading groceries, couples arguing lightly over forgotten items, children dragging coats 2 sizes too big. Ordinary scenes, functional love, messy, but mutual. At noon, my phone rang. It was Richard Harrington. I didn't answer at first. I watched it buzz itself quiet. Then, a minute later, it rang again. I answered. "Claire," he said. No greeting, no apology. "Dad," I replied. Neutral, accurate. "I don't have much time," he said, as if that still mattered. "I do," I said. "Go on." A pause. "Your mother is struggling." I closed my eyes. "That's not new." "She's not handling the loss of the company well," he said. "The loss of status." There it was. Not grief, not remorse. Status. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "I want you to come to dinner," he said. "Just us. Thanksgiving." I pictured it instantly. Susan's carefully arranged table, the empty chair where Evan would have sat if he hadn't moved to New York to avoid questions. The unspoken expectation that I would smooth the air simply by showing up. "No," I said. Richard exhaled. "She's your mother." "And you're my father," I replied. "Neither of you protected me when it mattered." "That's unfair," he snapped, a flicker of the old authority breaking through. "We gave you everything." "You gave me access," I said, "not belonging." Silence stretched. Finally, he said, "You've made your point." "No," I replied. "I made my boundary." He didn't argue. He simply hung up. That was how it ended. Not with reconciliation, not with understanding. With a line drawn so clearly, it no longer required explanation. That evening, I hosted my own Thanksgiving. Not elaborate, not performative. Eleanor came, wrapped in a wool coat, her cane tapping softly against the hardwood. Margaret Lowell flew in from St. Louis. Nora Jenkins came with her partner, unsure at first if she belonged, then relaxing when she realized she wasn't being evaluated. We ate too much. We talked about everything except the company until dessert, when Eleanor raised her glass. "To tables," she said. and to those who learned to build their own. No one clinked glasses dramatically. We didn't need to. After dinner, while I cleared plates, Eleanor stood beside me at the sink. "They'll never stop trying to reframe this," she said quietly. "They'll tell people you're cold, calculated, unforgiving." "I know," I replied. "Are you?" she asked. I considered the question. "I'm finished." She nodded. "That's different." In the weeks that followed, the last remnants of the old structure dissolved. Regulators closed their inquiries without charges, satisfied with restitution and reforms. The board finalized my appointment as CEO, unanimous this time. The press moved on, as it always does, chasing fresher scandals with louder characters. Susan tried one last time. She sent a Christmas card. No note, just a photo from years ago. Evan and me as children, standing in front of the Lake Geneva house, arms stiff around each other, smiling on command. I didn't respond. Instead, I framed the photo and placed it in a drawer. Some things don't need to be displayed to be acknowledged. On Christmas morning, I woke early and made coffee. Snow dusted the city lightly, just enough to soften the edges. My phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, from Margaret, from Nora, from Ellen. "Proud of you. Always." I replied with a simple heart. Not as sentiment, as truth. Later that afternoon, Julia Moreno called. "One last thing," she said. "The estate is fully settled. No further claims, no appeals." "Good," I said. "You did something rare," she added. "You ended a cycle without becoming what hurt you." I thought about that long after we hung up. I had expected revenge to feel sharp, satisfying, loud. Instead, it felt like quiet control. Like walking away without looking back and realizing you didn't need to. That night, I sat at my desk, the city dark and steady beyond the window. The company was stable, the trust was secure. The family, as it had existed, was gone. And yet, I felt no emptiness. Because what I had lost wasn't love. It was an illusion. One chapter remained, not to confront them, but to name what came after. 1 year later, I unlocked the office early and stood alone for a moment before turning on the lights. The city outside was waking up, traffic beginning to hum, coffee shops opening their doors. Ordinary life continuing, indifferent to whatever storms had passed through my name. That indifference felt like freedom. My title on the door now read, Chief Executive Officer. No interim. No qualifiers. The board had voted unanimously 6 months earlier after the last compliance review closed and the final restitution payments cleared. No applause, no ceremony, just a signed document and a quiet acknowledgement that stability had returned. Stability built without fear. I set my bag down and looked at the framed photo on my desk. My grandfather in front of that first building. I kept it there not as a reminder of legacy, but as a reminder of restraint. He had built something slowly, carefully, without spectacle. That was how I intended to lead. People often ask what happened to my family. I don't offer details. Richard Harrington retired quietly to a smaller house in Wisconsin. He never asked to meet again. Evan Harrington stayed in New York, moving between consulting roles that never lasted long enough to grow roots. Susan Harrington stopped attending extended family gatherings after the will challenge failed. According to Margaret, she tells people, "I changed," as if that explains everything without requiring reflection. They are free to tell whatever version of the story helps them sleep. So am I. On my calendar that morning was a lunch with Helen Park and 2 external advisors. We were discussing a long-term employee equity program. Not as optics, as structure. Something that made loyalty unnecessary because fairness was built in. After the meeting, Nora Jenkins stopped by my office. "I got the final numbers from HR," she said. "Turnover's down 28% year over year." "That's not accidental," I said. She smiled. "No, it isn't." Before she left, she hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever miss them?" I didn't answer immediately. I watched the city for a moment. The way people moved with purpose when they felt they belonged somewhere. "No," I said finally. "I miss who I thought they were." She nodded, as if that made sense, because it did. That evening, I hosted a small dinner. Not a holiday, not a milestone. Just a table with people who showed up without expectation. Eleanor sat at one end, thinner now, quieter, but still observant. Margaret beside her. Julia came, out of court clothes for once, relaxed. A few colleagues. A few friends who had nothing to do with the company at all. No hierarchy, no performance. At one point, Eleanor reached across the table and touched my wrist. "You know," she said, "they'll study what you did someday." "Who?" I asked. "People who need permission to choose themselves," she replied. After dinner, as plates were cleared and coats gathered, Eleanor lingered by the door. "When I'm gone," she said calmly, "don't let them rewrite me either." "I won't," I said. She smiled. "Good, then we're done." Later, alone in my apartment, I opened the drawer where I kept the framed childhood photo. Evan and me, standing stiffly by the lake. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I placed it back and closed the drawer. Some chapters don't need revisiting to be closed. Before bed, I checked my messages. A note from Margaret, a short update from Helen, a text from Nora with a photo of her dog wearing a ridiculous sweater, and one message from an unknown number. "I heard you finally won." I deleted it without responding. Winning had never been the point. Choosing had. I had chosen to stop begging for space. Chosen to stop mistaking endurance for love. Chosen to replace silence with documentation, patience with action, loyalty with boundaries. The revenge, if anyone insisted on calling it that, wasn't loud. It was structural. It was permanent. And it didn't require forgiveness to work. I turned off the lights and stood by the window one last time, watching the city settle into night. Somewhere, families were gathering. Somewhere, someone was being told to be grateful for less than they deserved. I hoped they would choose differently. If this story felt familiar, if you've ever been excluded, overlooked, or told to stay quiet for the sake of family, you're not alone. Share your thoughts in the comments. Like the video if you stayed until the end. And subscribe if you want more stories about boundaries, delayed justice, and the quiet kind of payback that lasts. Some tables are never meant to include you. That doesn't mean you don't belong. It means it's time to build your own.